So the G7 ended this weekend, with world leaders gathering in Cornwall to reach a coordinated Western strategy on the world's most pressing matters. The G7 countries consist of Canada, France, Germany, Japan, Italy, the United Kingdom, and the United States, and they were joined by guest countries Australia, India, South Korea, and South Africa. So in this video, we will summarize what was discussed in the summit and what outcomes the G7 reached. The key theme of the summit was building back better. On Saturday, Biden won the support of the G7 for his carry-on spending plan. The plan was effectively a rejection of post-COVID austerity and instead calls for continued economic stimulus of the economy. It is the antithesis of the government policy of austerity following the 2008 global financial crisis. The G7 also vowed to use this expansionary fiscal policy to ensure uniform recovery across all parts of society and thereby reducing social inequality. This was another problem that had arisen from the 2008 austerity policies. Foreign policy on Russia was also something discussed in the G7. One of Joe Biden's key aims was a show of Western solidarity before his forthcoming meeting with Vladimir Putin in Geneva. The US president wrote in the Washington Post that he was aiming to rally the world's democracies and perform a major reset of foreign policy after the unpredictability brought about by the Trump administration. G7 foreign ministers, after meeting last month to prepare the ground, said that they were deeply concerned about the negative pattern of Russia's irresponsible and destabilizing behavior. After landing in the UK on Wednesday night, Biden told US troops at an airbase in Suffolk, "We are going to make it clear that the US is back, and democracies of the world are standing together to tackle the toughest challenges and issues that matter most to our future." China was notably absent from the G7, and this is because Western democracies believe it poses a threat. That is why India, Australia, and South Korea had been invited to the summit. They are countries which are particularly concerned with the superpower's growing influence. Biden's agenda was to persuade European nations to take the threat of China's sway on democracies more seriously, as Chinese investment in infrastructure and businesses pours into Europe. To that effect, the G7 all agreed to back a plan called Build Back Better for the World, or otherwise B3W. This plan will act as a Western rival to China's Belt and Road Initiative, which offers Chinese loans to countries for infrastructure development. The B3W plan offers an alternative to this scheme, which the G7 hopes will reduce China's influence on poorer countries looking to borrow and build. The B3W will focus on climate change, health, digital technology, and gender equity. However, aside from rivaling Chinese influence, the world leaders did not yet agree on the details of this scheme, such as how it would be funded or what exactly it would involve. A crucial part of the G7 agenda was the equal distribution of vaccines around the world. The G7 pledged to donate 1 billion vaccine doses to the world's poorer nations, with the UK pledging at least 100 million doses within the next year. US President Joe Biden pledged to purchase 500 million doses of Pfizer COVID vaccine to donate to poorer countries. In addition to global vaccination efforts, the G7 agenda was also about developing a coordinated global approach to tackle future pandemics. On Saturday, the G7 agreed to a series of global health commitments, which will be captured in something called the Carbis Bay Declaration. Specifically, the declaration included international commitments to strengthen the World Health Organization, to reduce the vaccine production process to just 100 days, and to create early warning mechanisms for new viruses. The G7 also reached somewhat of a consensus on a global tax regime. As outlined in our previous video on this topic, Pillar 1 of the new regime allows governments to levy tax on the world's most profitable multinational organizations based on their place of activity and not their headquarters. This was the most difficult part of the regime to agree on, but the G7 did reach a consensus. They will back a tax of at least 20% on any profits above a 10% threshold that multinationals make overall. We should note, however, that the G7 represent only a fraction of the world's countries. While the G7 agreement will set the tone for negotiations, the regime will be fully discussed at the G20 conference next month, with the OECD present. At the G20 conference, any disagreements to this regime are expected to become more apparent. For example, from the UK side, Rishi Sunak is seeking a financial services exemption from the new tax regime, fearing it would hurt big banks based in the city and force them to relocate. The EU is in the same position. Conversely, on the US side, Joe Biden is pushing for the scope of Pillar 1 to be extended so that it does not only affect US tech giants. While the G7 may clash on Pillar 1 of the new tax regime, they are all on the same page for Pillar 2 and will unreservedly back a global minimum corporate tax of 15%. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has made climate change a top priority for the G7 summit. This is in part because Britain is due to host the COP26 climate conference in November 2021 and wants to set the tone. At the end of the G7 summit, the world leaders have renewed a pledge to raise $100 billion a year to help poor countries cut emissions. They plan to distribute these funds through a Green Belt and Road Plan, which will provide poor countries with a source of green infrastructure financing and will also limit Chinese influence. The G7 countries also announced that they plan to limit global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees Celsius. They also promised to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050, to halve emissions by 2030, and conserve or protect at least 30% of the world's land and oceans by 2030. Although not explicitly part of the G7 agenda, the European Union leaders used the summit to pressure Boris Johnson regarding the most recent dispute over the Northern Irish border. Joe Biden has had concerns that this dispute would compromise the peace process, and to that effect, he has been gently nudging Johnson to accept the EU's rules with a proposed Swiss model in Northern Ireland. Despite international pressure to make concessions, on Saturday, Boris Johnson issued a defiant statement, saying he will not hesitate to suspect the Northern Ireland Protocol. Clearly, the dispute is at an impasse. It may not harm the objectives of the G7 summit, but it definitely tarnishes the image of Western unity that Biden hopes to display to China and Russia. We will be covering the Northern Ireland border dispute in detail in a later video, so stay tuned for this as well. For now though, we have reached the end of our G7 video. As always, thank you so much for watching, and do leave a like, comment, and subscribe for more great content.